adverse drug reactions that weren't predicted in human trials have been recorded as the 4th to 6th leading cause of death in US hospitals. So that's huge. Many people are also being harmed by taking drugs and medicines that have been approved in animal trials, but these animal trials haven't been able to predict what has happened in humans. And we've seen that throughout history. We can look at the thalidomide tragedy that happened, where pregnant women were given a drug to help with morning sickness that was tested on a wide variety of animals, causing no ill effects. And then these women had, unfortunately, children with many different malformations. I mean, they were known as the flipper generation. And actually, we're still seeing side effects from that today, so that's how long it's lasted. That was in the 1950s to 60s.
Hi, this is Bruce Lipton, and you're listening to Planet FM.
Kia ora, greetings, and welcome to Planet FM 104.6. I'm Tim Lynch, and I trust that you are doing well. I invite you to stay with me over the next hour as we discuss and find ways to take care of our unique and magnificent green planet Earth. In the studio this morning, I have Tara Jackson, and she's the Executive Director of the New Zealand Anti-Vivisection Society. So I want to say kia ora for wanting to really get a story to all listeners about the plight of our animal kin. Thank you.
Kia ora, Tim. Thank you for having me.
Lovely. There's a piece in the New Zealand Herald on the 11th of June 1890 by a person called John Abbott of St George's Bay Road in Parnell, here in Auckland, calling for a halt to the cruelty of vivisection. Yet his was only a voice in the wilderness in those days. And we hear about a person called Henry Stephen Salt, and he lived from 1851 to 1939. And he was the one, in many ways, who influenced Gandhi's study of vegetarianism, but he was very strongly against vivisection. And he formed the Humanitarian League in 1891, and its aim was to enforce the principle that it is iniquitous to inflict avoidable suffering on any sentient being, and its objects included the banning of vivisection as well as hunting as a sport. In New Zealand, there was some interest in the cause, and vivisection was occasionally debated. And a few groups, including feminist organisations and many Theosophical Society members, condemned it. But with all the challenges of different viewpoints, even the SPCA members had a range of views from total opposition to reluctant acceptance. And then there was Betty Overell, who in 1989, she led a march to Parliament with a petition signed by over 100,000 New Zealanders demanding the abolition of all experiments on animals after obtaining affidavits from doctors all over the world who claim vivisection is medically and scientifically invalid. And Betty Overell is recognised internationally for her work in the abolitionist movement. So we are following the footsteps now, Tara, of being able to make greater headway in taking care of our little furry critters and other animals. So can you tell me, why did you become involved in the New Zealand Anti-Vivisection Society?
Sure. Firstly, yes, Bet Overall was our fierce leader, and she's the founder of NZAVS, and I'm very proud to stand here today on her shoulders as such. I always like to think that we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors, and she paved the way for all the successes that we have today. So I'm incredibly proud that we had her as a leader. I got involved in NZAVS. I actually went to university and studied zoology, so my degree's in zoology. After that, I went and worked at Greenpeace for a bit, and I interned at the Green Party with Mojo Mathers as her animal welfare intern. And then I got the job at NZAVS as campaign manager, and it spoke to me right to the core of who I am, because I've always been a huge science geek. I love biology, always have, hence why I studied zoology. And the scientific arguments against animal experimentation, they just make so much sense to me. You cannot use one complex system to predict the outcomes of another. It's just, by definition, you cannot model a complex system. That my strong passion for valid science and my obvious strong passion for animal rights kind of combined together and pushed me into this role. And I worked as campaign manager for 2 years, and now I've been executive director for 2 and a bit years. So I like to think my life has been a journey to get to this point and work for NZAVS and continue what Bet Overall did into the future and actually end animal experimentation in New Zealand.
Well, compassion is a very important, it's one of the baselines of humanity. It's the idea or the feeling of care. And so when you came across vivisection, I mean, it's a heartbreaking thing to realise that animals are being used for experiments. How did this affect you?
Yeah, well, I had to actually see myself the use of animals for dissection purposes during my zoology degree, and it was hard to stomach. There were a lot of times where I walked out of the classroom very upset. There was one particular case that is just ingrained into my mind, and that is we were in a lab and one of our teachers walked in wheeling a trolley with one possum head for every student. So this was a possum head that had literally just been cut off from the body. The vertebrae cord was still hanging out. The eyes were open. The tongues were out. It was something from a horror movie to me. And my mouth just dropped. I wasn't really prepared for it. And we were told that our assignment was to remove the skin, the hair, the flesh, and get it down to a bone. And we were being graded on how well we could get this head translated into just a skull. So we were getting graded on how white the skull was, if there was any breaks in the skull. We were not learning the names of the bones, the evolutionary significance of the bones. We weren't learning any of that. We were essentially just learning how to remove the skull from a head. And I refused to do it. So I left that lab. I took the possum head with me. I didn't want to cut it up. I thought that was really disrespectful. And I wrote an email to my teacher saying that I just ethically and morally refused to do it. And he made me write a page-long essay as to why I didn't want to do it. And I did, happily. I wrote more than a page about why I thought that using animals as lab tools was ethically wrong, and this was totally unnecessary. I wasn't even learning anything of value. I mean, I didn't do a zoology degree to learn how to create a perfect skull.
Wield a scalpel, really. That's what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not what I was paying, thousands of dollars to learn. I wanted to learn about animals so that I could help them in the future. So that's just one of the many cases I kind of faced at university. Opt-out policies weren't advertised. I mean, at the end of that year, once I knew more of the students and I told them that I had actually got given a separate assignment that didn't involve cutting anyone up, they were all like, oh, well, what? We would have rather had done that too, but we didn't know that it existed. So, yeah, there is a big problem in not advertising these non-harmful, non-invasive, non-animal-based replacements that could be used, especially for teaching. So, yeah, that's probably the most vivid case that's ingrained in my mind, but I've seen animals used for dissection purposes right from high school and went right up until, university, which I now know it can be replaced so easily. There are amazing, viable alternatives to using animals for dissections that are available here and all around the world, that there's no need to use animals for dissection purposes at any school in New Zealand at all. That could end today. That could have ended yesterday.
Well, we see anatomical plastic components of a full-blooded human being, be it male and female, and you can take these parts out and you can see each individual organ. This could be done for animals as well, yes? Yes,
and it is done for animals. Schools, universities use them globally. In New Zealand, we're a bit behind, which is something I want to fix quite passionately. So there are incredible alternatives that exist out there. And just recently, actually, I visited Massey University, where I got to see some of these animal replacements in real life. And I didn't actually know that Massey were that progressive and actually adopting these non-animal based methods that exist. Now, as I say that, I also need to recognise the fact that they still use animals for, highly invasive purposes for research, testing and teaching, and they do not only use non-animal replacement methods, but I did get to see their clinical training room for vets. And it was very impressive. I mean, they had mannequins of all different species for students to use. They had this giant horse mannequin that could actually mimic different disorders that students had to pick up. They had They had fake dogs that could also mimic different heart conditions that students would have to listen for, and robot dogs essentially, and the teacher could change the different condition that the dog was suffering from. And so many incredible things there. There were fake skin for students to practice their surgical skills on, so that by the time they actually get to shadowing a real life vet, they are more equipped to helping. So yeah, these methods are being adopted in some places, but not in enough places.
Well, it comes in, I think, when the scientists or the scientific and the commercial factors come together, because they know they can make money somewhere, and this is where it all gets the waters get muddy, isn't it?
Yes. And what I've found in my personal experience is that different universities have different attitudes towards adopting these more advanced, progressive and humane methods. The likes of the University of Otago, they've just spent $50 million on building a new animal lab. They are way down the bottom of the list in terms of being progressive and moving towards humane teaching methods. Whereas Massey, they're kind of on the other end of the spectrum, where they are, especially for training vets, they are looking for these viable methods that could be used in place.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that Massey are pushing the bar up.
Yes, I've been more and more impressed with Massey. I mean, they are still doing invasive experiments and they are still using animals to predict human outcomes, which we know is scientifically invalid. But you do have to recognise the small steps of progress as they happen. So
yes, it's an incremental step that we need to take to see that we can slowly free these animals up further into the future, because we've got an average of around about 300,000 animals are used in vivisection in New Zealand each year. And experiments are performed in universities and schools and polytechnics, commercial laboratories, government departments and ministries. And the species used includes hamsters, mice, rats, guinea pigs, sheep, cattle, goats, birds, fish, alpaca, buffaloes, cats, deers, dogs, donkeys, horses, pigs, and more. You know, wow, it's like half Noah's Ark there being dissected.
Yeah, and unfortunately a lot of people think that animal experimentation doesn't happen in New Zealand, when it does, as you've just proved. So what I need to clarify is that those 300,000 animals who are used every year in New Zealand for claimed scientific purposes, they're actually used for research, testing and teaching purposes. And not all of those cases can be classified as vivisection or animal experimentation. So even though we are against a vast majority, we cannot sit here and say that we are against 100% of cases that are included in that 300,000 animal figure. And that is, I need to be clear when I say this, it is the small cases where people are doing things like non-invasive, non-harmful teaching methods, where someone might bring their cat to school in vet nurse training to show people the right way of handling a cat. Now, that isn't something we would actively campaign against,
no.
But it is still something that you would have to get animal ethics approval for, so it is still included in those annual statistics. So there are the rare cases like that are still included that we wouldn't be against, but I'd say a vast majority could end.
Yes. So, Tara, what is the main focus right now for the society?
One of the biggest barriers that I think we face is this huge misconception that society has that animal experimentation is a necessary evil. You've just read a figure that 300,000 animals are used for animal experimentation in New Zealand, and I've just clarified what that actually means. But what that shows is that we clump everything together, and we clump every use of animals for scientific claimed purposes all together. So that kind of creates a really easy way for animal researchers to hide amongst that mix of things, because when you clump them all together, it can all hide under the whole animal experimentation as a necessary evil veil as such. But when you actually bring it out and pull it apart piece by piece, you can actually see that in New Zealand last year alone, 2016, only about 6.5% of animals used in New Zealand for research, testing and teaching were used for medical research. And that is the number one thing that I believe that society permits animal experimentation for, is for medical research. Now that's scientifically wrong as such, because you just cannot use a different animal to predict human outcomes to drugs or disease. It's just not scientifically viable, and there's copious amounts of scientific evidence backing that.
Yes.
I mean, we're looking at over 9 out of 10 experimental drugs that work in animals fail in humans.
That needs to be known more to the public.
It does, and I think that is right there is our biggest job. Our biggest job is dismantling that misconception that animal experimentation is a necessary evil. Cross out the necessary. Animal experimentation is an evil.
Thank you.
And I think that once we can dismantle that misconception, then all other uses for animals will no longer be permitted by society. The social license for animal experimentation will be gone.
Well, you see, what it is in many ways, from what I gather, it's a numbers game. They'll try all these different chemicals and just see how a particular animal will react to all these chemicals. And then if that doesn't work, they'll put another combination together. Whereas in many cases, if you go back, intuition sometimes is a wonderful teacher. And if you look at all the old herbalists for the last 10,000 years, the shaman, the tohunga, the medicine men, when they were really aligned, they would allow their intuition to tell them, this is the medicine you require, or these are the herbs put together in such a way that you need to heal from a particular ailment. Whereas there are so many very, very good herbal remedies around today. However, the pharmaceutical giants, along with chemical companies and the oil companies, because a lot of drugs now just come from oil, they synthesize them and use these particular molecules for whatever way they want. They've sort of bulldozed into the arena, and they're using all these because they know they can patent it and then they can make money out of it. And so what they're doing now is they're getting animals to be the study, the guinea pig, for all these different experiments using different drugs so that they can get this drug onto the market as soon as possible so that they can make money. And when we look at the science, we find that there are so many human beings who are actually dying from overdoses or any other reaction from having multiple drugs. Like some people in an old people's home can get 13 different drugs in a day, when in actual fact, clear all those drugs away. And I have heard that people have actually got up out of bed after all those drugs have been stopped and actually gone home. And so, again, I think we have got a big medical establishment that have got very, very hard and harsh rules that money is the driving force or profit for the corporation, and any one or any animal or anything that gets in the way, they won't stand for. And so this is a big challenge for people to acknowledge, isn't it?
Yes, and there are so many factors involved in the animal experimentation industry that perpetuate it continuing into the future. And it's interesting that you mentioned pharmaceutical companies, because we at NZAVS have pages and pages of statements from pharmaceutical companies admitting that animal models aren't reliable and should end for predicting human outcomes, for predicting how drugs respond in humans. They're admitting that it doesn't work, and they're admitting that drugs aren't being properly assessed before going out into the market because they are being tested on animals first. And with that, there becomes so many problems that come off using animal models to predict human outcomes. And one of them is, as you mentioned, the danger to humans. I mean, that's huge. I've got a figure here. Animal-based research hurts humans too, not just animals. And adverse drug reactions that weren't predicted in human trials have been recorded as the 4th to 6th leading cause of death in US hospitals. So that's huge. Many people are also being harmed by taking drugs and medicines that have been approved in animal trials, but these animal trials haven't been able to predict what has happened in humans. And we've seen that throughout history. We can look at the thalidomide tragedy that happened, where pregnant women were given a drug to help with morning sickness that was tested on a wide variety of animals, causing no ill effects. And then these women had, unfortunately, children with many different malformations. I mean, they were known as the flipper generation. And actually, we're still seeing side effects from that today. So that's how long it's lasted. That was in the 1950s to 60s. And that's just one of the most famous examples of when animal experimentation, or using animal models to predict human responses, has been harmful to people. There was a recent example in 2006 where an experimental drug called TGN 1412 was used, and it actually created the opposite effect in humans that happened in animals, and people were left with organ damage. It was in 2006, and it made news headlines. So there are a lot of cases that do happen, and we've got many examples on our website. But what you also have to remember is a lot of the adverse side effects will be under confidentiality clauses because people sign away.
This is true. This is this gag thing. Gags are the worst thing for the human society because it doesn't allow people to tell the truth to the public.
Yes.
What I want to know, farm animals are experimented on to make them grow faster, have more babies, use food more efficiently, or to change the quality of their milk. And there's the other cruel genetic modifications and cloning experiments. I mean, I've seen pictures with rats that have got all these different types of bodies extruded. Their bodies seem to be bloated through cancer growth. And one of the big things about GE and GMOs is that the biotech corporations hide all the experiments. You cannot actually see the experiments of rats that have been fed genetically made rice or corn or wheat or potatoes or whatever. You don't see that. They hide it from you. If it's a bad outcome, then you'll never hear about it. So what we've got is secrecy on a huge scale, and the poor animal kingdom is being tortured.
Yes, and a perfect example of that lack of transparency is at the University of Otago, where their animal lab is right in the centre of town. It's the Herkes building, and the top floor is where the animals are kept, and the windows are all blacked out. And that's like the 5th floor of this building. So that speaks volumes. If it's nothing to be ashamed of, why hide it from the public? Why go through all that effort to black out the windows if what you're doing is so necessary and humane? And the answer is because it's not necessary and it's not humane. But the lack of transparency is something that not only we acknowledge as people who campaign to end animal experimentation, but I'm confident enough to say that people within the industry recognise the lack of transparency too. And what this means for us is that we find it quite difficult to find out exactly what's going on in New Zealand and who's doing what. I mean, we have a list of all the facilities in New Zealand who use animals for research, testing and teaching, but only a small portion of them are subject to the Official Information Act. And that's how we find out a lot of information about what people are actually doing, but we can only do that from public-funded, mainly, facilities. So all the private companies, huge question mark as to what they're doing. We don't have a lot of information about what private companies are doing. It's only when they want to tell us what's going on. So I can guarantee that a lot of the high-impact stuff that's happening on animals in New Zealand will be at private companies.
Well, it must be very difficult too. You apply for a job thinking that you're going to be doing some wonderful scientific experiments, and then they bring in an animal, and you think, oh gosh, and they say, well look, do you want your salary? Do you want the job? If you don't want the salary or the job, take a hike.
Yeah.
And so it must torture even people's psyche too, that they think, oh God, what am I going to do, particularly if you've got a mortgage?
Yes, that is a real thing. You can even see that from a lower level of using animals for dissection purposes in high school. We can see that that creates less compassion towards animals. So I've actually met people doing research on animals who had no choice but to do that in terms of funding. They wouldn't be given any funding unless they used an animal model. And that just shows the scale of this problem, is even when the individual researchers don't want to use animals, they come across huge obstacles. I mean, if that were me, then I would have gone about it differently myself. I would have said, okay, cool, I won't do that research. I'll go somewhere else and do it. But that's coming from my perspective and my strong stance and values. But yeah, there are so many issues like that where people can't even do what they want to do in regards to research.
So at the moment, you're wanting to educate the public. Where do you get your support from, Tara?
We get a lot of support from the public. I mean, we've had people who have supported NZAVS right from the 70s and 80s, and they still support us today. And every single day we're getting more and more people learn that animal experimentation still goes on in New Zealand. And as soon as they learn about, like, the scientific argument against vivisection and using animals to predict human outcomes, on top of the ethical issues, the huge ethical issues in using animals as lab tools, they're on side with us. So it's a growing vehicle as such, and we're continuously chugging along, moving along, and getting more and more supporters. And I think, given the passion and the strong drive that a lot of our supporters have, and our staff have in particular, I think that an end to animal experimentation is inevitable.
Well, way back, I think, in 1999, there was a big debate in Parliament in New Zealand as to give the 4 great apes, the bonobo, the gorilla, the orangutan and the chimpanzee, human rights. And I would have loved New Zealand to have really made that fantastic stand to really tell the rest of the planet that we're prepared to call these beings as having human rights, because that would have started the ball rolling elsewhere. I mean, I think India is now involved in giving certain rights. I think they're giving rights to dolphins. And as you say, we're nudging towards being aware of these other sentient beings that share breath with us. A lot of people don't realise, when as a zoologist you see the web of life and you see the interconnectivity of all beings on this planet, because they've all got their sort of their niche. And I would like to think that we have some champions in New Zealand. Have we got some real champions?
Yeah, it's interesting you mention the non-human primates. Those 4 non-human primates are actually exempt from ever being used for research, testing or teaching purposes in New Zealand.
Yes.
But that isn't a blanket statement for all non-human primates. The rest of them still could be used in New Zealand. And a really interesting part about that is that those animals could still be used overseas, and that is the most realistic way that they would be used, because financially it makes sense. In New Zealand we do not have the facilities to do research on non-human primates, so those 4 species could be being tested on overseas using New Zealand funding and by under the hands as such of New Zealand companies. So a lot of these changes we do hear about are almost fruitless. Animals in New Zealand law are sentient. I mean, if we followed that, no animal would be used at all for animal experimentation if we truly recognise that they are sentient. But yes, we have had some huge victories in New Zealand. One of them was the ban on cosmetics testing on animals. And although no animals that we know of were being tested on for cosmetic purposes, this now wipes New Zealand off the list of countries around the world where it can happen. And it's a global movement where more and more countries are saying no, they're banning it. And so a big motivation to get that ban here was that once companies start running out of countries to do this testing in, the fear was that they would come to New Zealand, and now they don't have that option. The second step that hasn't happened yet is a ban on the importation of cosmetics that have been tested on animals elsewhere, which we hope to start in the future. Another great win was the ban on psychoactive substance testing on animals, which was huge. I mean, we had rallies all around New Zealand that both NZAVS and Hoo-Ha organised, and there were multiple groups that were involved in that campaign, as well as the cosmetics testing ban campaign as well. So other wins, we also removed the requirement for the DRAIS test from the Hazardous Substance Act. So the DRAIS test is a really cruel test done normally on rabbits, where test substances are put in the eyes and on the skin of rabbits to test skin irritancy to certain substances. And there was a requirement for data from a DRAIS test to be submitted with every new hazardous substance in New Zealand. So that requirement has now been removed, which is awesome. I mean, not just from a ethical perspective, but the DRAIS test is a test that's never been validated against human data before. I mean, there have been studies done where they've done a DRAIS test on the same rabbit and had different results each time. And that's what you get when you test chemicals on complex systems. I mean, they don't always react to the same drug every time, which highlights why the heck you would use a mouse to predict the outcomes of humans. You're creating the gap of unpredictability. You're making it even bigger when you use different species. So yes, we removed that from New Zealand law, which we were really excited about. And I think a huge victory that it is. It's hard to measure, but just the fact that people talk about animal experimentation more, that people, as when they go to the supermarket, they're looking at their dishwashing liquid and whether or not it's been tested on animals. This has become a topic that more and more Kiwis in particular care about and are talking about. And a huge success, I guess, that's come from that is that we have created a children's book called The 6 Foot Rats that we are in the process of sending to every single school in New Zealand. And that is helping introduce that concept that animals can't predict the human response, and it's almost laughable to think so, and that's why it's called The 6 Foot Rats. I mean, it's about these 2 lab rats who learn that they're being tested on to predict the human response, and they realise how silly that is, and they go on strike because they thought that they were being tested on for 6 foot rats, not for humans. And it's just a really light, funny, well, not funny, but light and engaging way of teaching children about this and introducing them to such a sensitive and quite scary topic. I mean, we didn't want to cause any nightmares, but we did want children to start thinking about these types of things.
Very important. Now, I'm speaking with Tara Jackson, the Executive Director of the New Zealand Anti-Vivisection Society, and their website is nzavs.org.nz. nzavs.org.nz. The Body Shop. Anita Roddick. I remember I was in the UK around about the 1970s, and the Body Shop first came into being, and she was strong on that. She wanted to make sure that her products were not going to be tested on any animals whatsoever. This is a big one. If we can get people who use a lot of cosmetics to say, okay, I'm going to read every label. Yet L'Oreal's starting to move that way too. Is that correct? Because they did actually buy the Body Shop.
Yes.
So tell me, because I mean, I'm happy that we spell it out, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys.
Yes, so the Body Shop are great now because they're no longer owned by L'Oreal. They're owned by a parent company who doesn't test on animals.
Oh, good.
So we support the Body Shop now.
Yes.
Because they are fully cruelty-free. But when they were owned by L'Oreal, we weren't active supporters of them because essentially that money's still going back to a parent company who does support animal experimentation. So L'Oreal still sell their products in China where there's mandatory requirements for animal testing to be done. So if a cosmetic company sells their products in China, then they do not genuinely care about animals. They are not genuinely against animal experimentation. We know of a lot of companies who refuse to sell in China because of that risk. I mean, Lush is a great one. Lush would never compromise on that matter, so they do not sell in China, and they do the exact opposite in that they raise a lot of money to actually donate to groups like NZAVS and other anti-animal experimentation groups and researchers developing non-animal based research methods, and they donate money to actively end animal experimentation rather than what a lot of companies do, where they have a nice big line on their website about how they're strongly opposed to animal experimentation except when required by law. And that is the statement to look out for, because that means we sell in China.
Yes, okay. Now, before I mentioned about champions, I mean, once 25 years ago, Peter Blake was aiming to become the champion for the global environment, but unfortunately his life was cut short by bandits in the Amazon jungle. And had Sir Peter Blake been alive today, he would have been at the forefront of environmental consciousness for leading New Zealand, and I trust he would have been leading our planet. But we lost him. Have we got any champions, global champions, for animals? I know that, let me see, I know that we need some. We haven't got any politician who has really stood out. Lucy Lawless has done a lot for Greenpeace. Have we got anyone whom you can shout out so that we can say, hey, courageous you?
Yes, so there are individuals and there are organisations all around the world who I would consider champions for animal experimentation. And the first person I think of as an individual is Dr. Ray Greek, and he is definitely the most qualified person who is anti-vivisection, and he he openly speaks to the science. He's a researcher. He's an absolute expert on he's the founder of the trans-species modelling theory, which is the basis of our entire argument, and that using animals to model the human response is scientifically flawed. And he's very active in the academic world, continuously creating more papers and more literature for us as campaigners to refer to. So I would say he's a huge champion. I think of other organisations around the world, like the new Biomed 21 group, who is a group of researchers from all around the world who have come together to advocate the need for more human-relevant research methods. And they're all above and beyond in terms of qualified, and they are pushing for more human-relevant research and testing methods to be used purely on scientific grounds, and that it's more scientifically viable to use models that are relevant to us.
Any pop singer, film star?
There are lots of people who have actively spoke out about animal experimentation all around the world. I mean, the biggest one I can think of at the moment is Ricky Gervais, who has jumped on board on a campaign to call for a science hearing to happen in the UK, where this amazing organisation called For Life on Earth is campaigning to get a scientific debate with a whole lot of rules around it so that it's independent and fair, and fairly judged, I mean, so that there's pro and anti-vivisection groups from the scientific community only coming in, submitting evidence as to why animal models either do or don't predict human outcomes to drugs and disease, and then having that actually judged by a group of expert panels. They're pushing for that to happen. They want these experts to come and actually figure out once and for all in a public domain, do animals hold any predictive value to humans? And I already know the answer. And I also think that the animal researchers know the answer too, because so far they've been too scared to step forward and say yes. So Ricky Gervais has jumped on board into that campaign to push it into the public sphere to try and get more support for that, which I'm hoping really happens, because that would just send ripples across the world, and that the findings from that would be huge.
Anybody else? Any New Zealand politician?
Mojo Mathers
Yes.
has been amazing in supporting us. She's unfortunately no longer a Green MP, but she was vital in the campaign to get a ban on cosmetics testing on animals in New Zealand, and she did a lot of work to do that. She's been very supportive of us in the past, and it's an absolute shame that she's not in there at the moment, but fingers crossed for the future. Another MP who was supportive is Gareth Hughes, and he has supportive in campaigns to end animal experimentation, and I'm hoping that in the future he'll be more supportive and our relationship will grow.
Very good. So there's nobody in the National Party, the Labour Party, or say New Zealand First? Because we need to, I don't want to use the word target, but we need to be able to approach these people and say, look, come on, commit.
The National Party are definitely not that supportive. There are no supportive national MPs that I know of in regards to ending animal experimentation. Labour, there are likely a few. I know one offhand, and that's Jo Lugston. She's been supportive of us in the past, and she actually rescued an ex-lab rat when she was younger, so she also has that emotional pull to it. But yeah, national, no. New Zealand First, no. It's very much the MPs who have actually stepped forward actively and loudly have been Green MPs.
Yeah, it's interesting how that all works out. Yes. I can't quite work out that once upon a time there was, I don't know, there was a spiritual dimension to the fact that people cared. I mean, Christianity, this morning I had a look to see if animals had souls. That's by doing a web search. And I saw about St. Francis of Assisi. And he saw animals as being something very, very important in the world. I mean, that they were, well, we had their milk and their meat and their fur and their hides, and they were seen in many cases in the Judeo-Christian ethic as a means to an end. We can eat these animals, or we can utilise these animals. And so I'm going to take the jump. You are a vegan, is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Yes. Now, it's interesting because I myself, I haven't eaten meat or poultry for over 41 years. And I feel strong. I feel healthy. I can do a very hard day's work without having to eat meat. And I'm an O blood group. And if you follow blood groups, O blood groups are carnivores. And yet I can survive. So how did you come to extending your life to wanting to just eat a plant-based diet?
Yeah, I get asked this a lot, and I actually think right from the get-go of being born, I was on a journey to not want to partake in any form of animal exploitation. So as a little girl, I had a strong connection with animals. I loved all animals. I wanted to rescue them all. I loved the snails in the garden and was horrified when I found out Dad was killing them because they were eating his plants. Like, it's as far back as I can remember, I've loved animals and respected them so much. And when I became old enough to kind of make the decision, I became vegetarian, and that was around the age of 12, 13. And that was a reluctant decision from my parents. They came from the strong belief that a growing girl needed iron, and she needed to consume a lot of red meat. So there was a lot of protesting that went on in our house when it came to mealtime. So I was vegetarian for around 10 years, and then I transitioned to a vegan diet, and that was actually when I went to university. And when I studied zoology, I also studied environmental science. And I had the honour of having Mike Joy as one of my teachers.
Oh, okay.
And he gave a lecture on the environmental impacts that dairy had in New Zealand.
Yes.
And this is before I knew about bobby calves or about the huge ethical dilemma involved in dairy farming. This was before all of that. So hearing the environmental impacts was a switch for me, and I have not had dairy products since that lecture. It affected me that much, just to hear how much of a state of crisis our environment is in, mainly because of the dairy industry. And then from there, my knowledge just grew, and I learned more and more about animal products and where they come from. And I learned about the layer hen industry and how all the male chicks were, in vast majority, are just ground up live.
This is, I want to stop here because this is a horror story that they're thrown into a big conveyor belt that goes into this big, huge machine with flaying blades, and they're just destroyed in seconds, and there's thousands and thousands are going through this a day.
Yeah, when you think about the sex ratio, 50-50, as many females as you've got, that many males have.
And they've just been churned up. I mean, you'd have to have a heart of steel to go through and oversee that.
Yeah, and that's just one of the ethical issues involved in that industry. I mean, if you actually walk into a battery farm, it's something from a nightmare. I mean, you see these animals that are in tiny cages, crammed in. They've never seen sunlight. They've never felt fresh air. I mean, they're sitting there bored out of their mind. Half of them are missing feathers. Every second or third bird has a broken wing or foot or tumour. I mean, these animals have been selectively bred to have awful lives. I mean, it's like they're trapped inside their own bodies. I mean, that's how we've designed them to be. They grow so fast. I mean, broiler chickens live an awful life where they grow too fast that their legs can't sustain the weight, and that's they snap off. Yes. And a lot of them die from starvation because they can't walk to their food or water. And on top of that, I mean, broiler chickens, when they're born, the food is at one level, and as they get older, the food gets higher and higher and higher, so that the sick chicks can't access the food, so that the farmers aren't wasting any of that food on the sick chickens. So, I mean, a lot of chickens will die in broiler farms because of starvation. I mean, and this is stuff that happens in New Zealand. I mean, people hear it and they think, oh, that's in America, you know, that's in big old America. But this happens in New Zealand. This is battery farming. This is broiler chickens. This is when you're buying a roast chicken from the supermarket. This is what you're supporting. And it's, when you see it with your own eyes, it's heartbreaking to think that this is what we as a society support. And I know I will never, ever support that with my money. And I just strongly encourage people to go and visit one. Go and visit a broiler farm. Go and visit a battery farm. You would not want to support that. I truly believe that Kiwis are an animal-loving nation. And I just don't think that everyone knew what it was like in there. I don't think society would allow it any longer. So, yeah, I learned a lot of these things, and I went on a continuous journey of learning. And, I mean, I'm still learning things every day of how we exploit animals.
I am too.
Yeah, in New Zealand and around the world, I'm always learning about new ways that humans exploit animals, and it's heartbreaking, and I would rather spend my life actively not contributing to any of that and being a happy, healthy vegan.
Very good, because the interesting thing was, and I'll just jump in on this one, you mentioned cows and calves. I come from a dairy farm, and we had a lovely farm with a stream flowing through it, crystal clear stream. And Dad offered it to me when I was about 16. He said, "Oh, here's the farm." And I wanted bright lights, big city. Terrible. But I also woke up in the city. I actually realised a greater reality. The story was, I said, "Dad, why do you want to give away the farm?" And he said, "Oh, it's becoming too scientific." And he never ever killed one animal on our farm. If he did have to take a life, he'd phone the vet, and the vet would come and administer an injection to take that animal's life. But one of the things too, one day in the paddock there were all these pegs, and they were in a grid. And I said, "Dad, what are these pegs here?" And he said, "The fertiliser companies are here, and they're testing all these different fertilisers and chemicals to see what sort of grass grows best here so it can have a high production." But when I pushed Dad, I said, "Dad, why do you want to give up the farm?" And he said, "I refuse to take one more calf away from its mother." And people in the cities and the towns don't understand that. But when a cow gives birth to their calf, the first thing they do is they lick it, because part of the afterbirth stuck to the calf. And she's carried it for all the gestation time. And so she's connected to that little being. And so finally that little calf gets to walk, usually within about 5 hours or less. And then you come and you pick that calf up and you walk out the gate, shut the gate, and the cow's on the other side. The calf is bleating, the cow is mooing, and she's going up and down the fence line wanting her baby. People don't understand the sheer commotion of that, because for a cow to come into milk, to produce milk, it has to have a calf, it has to get pregnant and have a calf. A lot of people in the cities don't realise that that's that process.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the reasons why my dad wanted to give up farming. So I'm lucky to having such a sensitive man to be my father.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, there are so many things that people in the city do not understand. When you're in the rural sector, you're surrounded by animals and you want to take care of them. You see kittens being born, you see, well, you do that in the city as well, but you see greater animals like pigs and sheep and cows, and we have become separated from nature. We don't understand nature. And yes, there's some harsh things that happen in nature. I've been through the Serengeti Plains in Tanzania and up into Kenya, and I see how lions will always pick out usually the slowest or the weakest animal in the herd, and so they keep that herd strong and vibrant by taking out all the weak ones. But there is death, and after the lions, then the hyena, and then the hyena, and the jackal, and then the buzzards, and finally the ants, etc. I mean, our cycle of nature has got to me, is a cruel component. But that's just how it is, and we've got to accept that.
Yeah.
But we humans don't need to be cruel.
No, and all of this talk about animals and the animal ag sector is reminding me or highlighting that we haven't talked about an important part of animal experimentation in New Zealand, and that's that a majority of animals used in New Zealand for research, testing and teaching are actually used in order to enhance the animal agricultural industry. I mean, we're very different from every other country in the world that I know of, in that our number one used animal for research, testing and teaching purposes, it's not mice and rats, it's cows. Our number one used animal for the past 5 years that I've looked back is cows. And we are using thousands of cows each year in order to try and make them more productive, in order to try and make them create less of a harmful environmental impact. And this is all in order to keep that animal agricultural sector going for as long as possible and make it as productive as possible. And we are doing some awful things to cows and sheep and chickens and pigs. I mean, from humane slaughter studies is one of the most high impact studies that I've heard of, and that is done for the animal ag industry. It's done so that they can claim that they're killing them in a humane manner, and that involves the death of a lot of animals. That involves gassing piglets. That involves slitting the throats of cows while they're unconscious. There's awful experiments happening on these animals that, sure, they're going to face death in the animal agricultural sector anyway, so that's kind of what the animal researchers go off is, oh, well, they're going to die anyway. But you're still using these animals as commodities. You're still using them as lab tools, and you're just doing awful things to them. And I think a lot of New Zealanders are disconnected from that realisation that that's what we're using a majority of animals for here. And that stems right across to even the use of dogs for research, testing and teaching. I mean, working dogs are considered a very important part of the animal agricultural industry. I mean, there's approximately 150,000 working dogs in New Zealand. And
loving dogs, because dogs love their masters, don't they?
Yes.
They give themselves totally to their owner.
They're very loyal animals.
Yes.
And these animals are used as workers on farms. And there's a lot of research being done on dogs to try and enhance their lives and try and make it so that farmers know what diets to feed them to make them the most productive. They're doing things to measure the possibility of insecticides.
Yes.
Getting into the dogs.
Glyphosate.
Yeah, they're doing product testing on these dogs. They're doing a lot of things, and it all stems back to the animal agricultural industry. It's the same with veterinarian research. That's the number one category of animals used in New Zealand. That's the main purpose that they're done for, is vet research. Well, it was in 2016, and a lot of that is for the animal ag industry. So it's all interconnected, and that's what a lot of people wouldn't realise is, you can go to the supermarket and buy cruelty-free dishwashing liquid. That when you go and you buy your burger, you're not thinking that you're contributing to animal testing, when you really could be.
Yes. So we've got to read the labels, but we've got to get really, really savvy. I definitely agree. Now, there was one other thing that I do want to cover, is that when in my introduction I mentioned early the feminists in New Zealand were very much against vivisection. And then I mentioned the Theosophical Society. And a lot of people think, who are they? Well, they were a society that studied life. How does a human being become a human being? And why are we in the middle of existence somewhere? And there was a Britishman called Geoffrey Hodgson. And he was a clairvoyant. And he started off a vegetarian society here in New Zealand. But he was very strong as an anti-vivisectionist. But he was, as a clairvoyant, he would be able to go around New Zealand and look at abattoirs or freezing works, and he would see a dark thought form over every abattoir, so that where the animals were being slaughtered, he could actually see the pain and the fear overshadowing all these particular abattoirs. And this person is a very, very unique human being. He's one of the more interesting people of the last century who could actually see in between the worlds, so to speak. His sensitivities were so clear that he realised that we are doing horrendous things to the animal kingdom, and he could see it. And so it comes back to my other question, do animals have a soul? And they say that the recent Pope of today, he's actually saying that possibly that they do have. And he has this byline, all animals are accepted into heaven. Well, it's easily said than done, so to speak. But there is a greater component or greater measurement, because I know I've had a situation there where my cat died. And as soon as that cat died, a friend up the road actually saw this energy field of this cat come to them, and another one, even 25 k's away, saw this as well. Saw that my simian, my pussycat, come to them. And they saw this glow, and instantly as they saw this glow in the form of like an energy pussycat, they instantly knew his name. And this happened to me the same pussycat came to me when I was in America at the same time. So what I'm also offering up, and this is, Tara, you're doing it, is that you're taking care of the animal kingdom, and in many cases a lot of people don't realise that there's a higher level of being to all these animals. They're just not a mechanical body, but there's an essence there. Like we cannot see the essence of a flower, but it's there. And so we just have to realise that there's a greater, more profound story that we are involved in, but at the grassroots level, at the coalface of industry, you are doing mighty work because it's heartbreaking. It's too tough for me. I've got a girlfriend or ex-girlfriend in Australia, and she's right there with you alongside doing all this work. And she reads all the reports on what they're doing with animals and how they're dragging animals sometimes into freezing works there, and the legs are all broken. They don't care. They just tie the rope, and the cow is bellowing and screaming. And this has to stop. We've got to realise that the animals need an opportunity to live their life.
I always think if it's that hard to watch or to hear about, imagine how hard it is to live and experience for them. And that's what drives me a lot of the time, is this stuff is hard to hear, it's hard to learn about, but their lives are far worse than what I'm experiencing. But even if you don't like animals, even if you don't care about them as being sentient, when it comes to animal experimentation, you can be against it for humans. You can be against it because you want humans to have access to drugs and medicines that actually work, and you can be against it if you love science because you want the best of the best science to be used. There's so many benefits from ending animal experimentation that don't just come down to animal ethics, and the biggest one there is saving human lives. I mean, if the one thing you can take away from today is just look at something that we all know. Look at chocolate. Look at how differently it responds in dogs than humans. Look at penicillin. Now, penicillin was delayed from reaching humans for a long time because of how it responded in animals. I mean, it killed guinea pigs. It was metabolized too quickly in rabbits, so had no effect. And it was effective in mice and humans. So it's almost like, what animal species do we believe? It's like flipping a coin, but the gamble is on human lives and animal lives. So no matter what you care about, whether it's animals, science or people, ending animal experimentation is vital to enhance all three of those areas.
Thank you. And for you scientists who really want to experiment, please experiment on yourself first.
Don't.
Okay, no, don't. No, because you won't live. Thank you so much, Tara. Your website, please?
NZAVS.org.nz. NZAVS.org.nz. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to flick an email through the website as well. I'm always happy to answer questions.
I want to honour you and thank you, Tara.
Kia ora, thank you for having me.
That was Tara Jackson, the Executive Director of the New Zealand Anti-Vivisection Society. Decide to network. Use every letter you write, every conversation you have, every meeting you attend, every email you send. And remember, even Facebook. To tweet and to express your fundamental beliefs and dreams. Affirm to others the vision of the world you want. Network through thought. Network through action. Network through love. Network through the spirit. You are the centre of a network. You are the centre of the world. You are a free, immensely powerful source of life and goodness. Affirm it. Spread it. Radiate it. Think day and night about it, and you will see a miracle happen. The greatness of your own life in a world of big powers, media and monopolies, but of 7.6 billion individuals, networking is the new freedom, the new democracy, a new transparency, and a new form of wholeness and happiness. This originated by Dr. Robert Muller, Chancellor of the World Peace University in Costa Rica, Central America. I invite you to be able to come to greenplanetfm.com, where we have over 400 interviews in our database, which you can readily download and listen to. to be able to inspire yourself to become the change you want to see in the world. And become involved in caring for your children and grandchildren's future. We are also on Facebook, on Green Planet FM and ourplanet.org. Please come and love us. This is Tim Lynch.
And or Lisa Eyre.
And Liz Gunn.
In the spirit of Aroha, wishing you a wonderful week. We look forward to being with you next week. I say kia kaha and haere ura.